It's a wintry Friday night in southeast London. At a popular bar, people are celebrating the start of a weekend. When out of the blue, a gang of 4 men and a pit bull terrier savagely attack the bar's bouncers. Minutes later, one bouncer is critically injured, lying in a pool of blood. By the time medics and police arrive, the gang has fled. This is a particularly violent and brazen crime committed by a vicious gang. If the police are to track down these thugs, they must piece together all the forensic clues and infiltrate London's notorious criminal underworld. Catching a killer requires conclusive forensic evidence. From clues at the scene of the crime to minute examination in the forensics lab, from the cold reality of the pathologist's table to DNA sampling, digital analysis, each piece of killer evidence brings the murderer closer to justice. It's approaching midnight on the 10th of November 2000 in New Cross, London. At the Paradise Bar, a bouncer has been rushed to hospital after being mauled by a dog and stabbed multiple times. The crime scene immediately poses problems for Senior Investigating Officer Will O'Reilly.
When I first arrived there was lots of people hanging around. The ambulance had been at the scene. There was remnants of someone being treated for injuries. There was discarded bandages. The ambulance person's whole door was still at the scene. Probably best described as mayhem, really.
Will's most pressing duty is to impose control over the chaotic crime scene.
First steps are always to look at the preservation of the scene after the preservation of life, I guess. But by this stage, when I turned up, the injured person could be taken to hospital. So we're then looking at the preservation of the scene, and really then it's calling out some of the support services. Within the nightclub, we tried to put in something called a niller cordon to preserve the actual scene where the attack took place, and then an outer cordon to deal with escape routes. The club was still quite full downstairs, and we had to record everybody leaving the club. Instead of coming through the front door, we had to go through fire exits, take all their details, see if they'd seen anything significant. But our main thrust was that front door, where we knew we had at least one significant witness, which was the other bouncer. He may have very vital information about where a suspect has run to, for instance, or whether he's driven away in a vehicle or whatever. So it's about getting that intelligence quick time.
The second bouncer escaped relatively unharmed from the ferocious assault. His eyewitness testimony is the police's first piece of evidence. He informs Senior Investigating Officer Will O'Reilly that his injured colleague is George Napier.
The bouncer was the only really other eyewitness at the scene. Napier apparently had ejected the person who arrived at the nightclub at about 10:30. He was clearly high, probably on drink and drugs. He wanted to get in without paying. It was a £5 entrance fee. He was ejected by Mr. Napier, and he threatened him that he'd be back.
45 minutes later, the man returns with 3 others and a pit bull terrier dog. Without warning, all of them proceed to attack bouncer George Napier in a vicious assault.
They wanted to go back and get vengeance, and they just went back to that club and started attacking George Napier and the other bouncers, who obviously defended themselves. But George Napier was a very tall man and was the focal point of the attack.
The bouncer's witness testimony gives lead investigator Will the circumstances of the attack. But it's not something he or a prosecutor can build a case around. I think people think that eyewitness testimony, that's the stellar testimony, that is the gold standard. The reality is people, even good witnesses, when they're watching a traumatic event. It's so overwhelming. It's like someone's first parachute jump. Their synapses and their senses are just blown completely out, and they really will struggle to recall the exact detail. Now, if somebody has a particular physical attribute, or they might be able to tell whether they're black or white or Asian, but beyond that, often the details of recall are very, very poor. So that moves you right back to the area of forensics. The forensics, the science, can't lie. A few hours after the assault, George Napier is pronounced dead in hospital. This tragic event presents police with their second piece of evidence.
George Napier was taken to Lewisham Hospital, where sadly he died. We'd obviously had the call to the club, so that was one crime scene. But you've then also got George Napier, which has to go through a post-mortem examination to gather all that evidence of how he was stabbed, where he was stabbed and how he died, what was the cause of death, which is key to any SIO and his or her investigation to present to a court.
The post-mortem revealed that George Napier was stabbed multiple times, but it was ultimately the stab wound in the heart that killed him. It also indicated that the perpetrator of this terrible crime was incredibly violent and incredibly dangerous.
From what we discovered about George and from what the family liaison officer told us, he was called a gentle giant. He was 6'6". He had a partner and 3 children. One was only months old at the time of the murder, and he was part-time in there, working as a bouncer, mainly to provide for a better life for his family. It's crucial to get a successful conclusion to this case and successful conclusion for George Napier's family, really.
George's blood-soaked clothes are the third piece of evidence. They may produce clues via what's known as the Lockhart exchange principle, based on the philosophy of the pioneering 20th century French criminologist.
Edmund Lockhart had a principle which is basically one of exchange, and it says that every contact leaves a trace. If you can imagine that every time something comes into contact with something else, there's an exchange of material. There's a suspect entering a crime scene is going to be bringing material with them and potentially taking something away that might be a useful tool for the investigation itself.
The theory is that every contact leaves a trace. It's just sometimes very hard to find it. But because he had been in an encounter and fighting with others, you've got a high probability of fibres from your suspects getting onto his clothing and vice versa, fibres from his clothing getting onto your suspects. There's also the possibility that if one of the assailants was cut or injured, their blood may be on George's clothing. So getting his clothing is imperative and bagging it so you can do the right tests on it.
Going down the fibre route, first of all, you have the clothing of the victim. That's one thing. But you then need to get the clothing belonging to the suspects. And in this case, the suspects fled the scene and likely, sensibly, got rid of all the clothes they were wearing, which means that you don't have the second part of the puzzle. You have the victim's clothes, so potential fibres there, but you don't have the suspect's clothing, so you can't add A and B and make C. It means police will need to find the suspect's clothing, or hope blood evidence from George's clothes or forensics from the Paradise Bar can provide a breakthrough. This case will hinge on whether the police can provide the killer evidence to catch George's attackers and put them behind bars. At a popular southeast London bar, police investigating the brutal murder of bouncer George Napier have gathered essential evidence. Key witness testimony from his colleague. George's body with multiple stab wounds. And George's blood-stained clothing. They know how George died, but not the identity of the attackers. All the police know at this very early stage is that a gang of 4 young men and a pit bull terrier dog savagely attacked George and left him for dead. Their priority now is to gather all the crucial forensic evidence that will hopefully unmask his killers. The main crime scene is the foyer area at the Paradise Bar and Club. The confined space is both a blessing and curse for Senior Investigating Officer Will O'Reilly.
A small crime scene can present great opportunities, but it also can present some difficulties, especially if it's a lot of people have walked through it before we can seal it off. It was difficult because this is the main entrance to a bar and a club where people have trampled in and trampled out through the course of the evening. And of course the injured person had been worked on by the ambulance crew. So you got cross-contamination there. There was some blood splatter on the walls and stuff. So it was a difficult, mixed-up scene.
The lead investigator's right-hand man is Callum Sutherland, the crime scene manager. He plays a crucial role in coordinating the gathering of evidence.
My job is to manage it for him, give him the best advice possible as to what I think would be of forensic value and might get us from A to B as quickly as possible. It was also my job to call out the scientists that I would need.
The importance of the crime scene manager simply cannot be underestimated. If they consider a scene as a murder scene, then they're obviously going to hyper overdrive and actually consider everything and prioritise and have a whole series of priorities in relation to fingerprints, CCTV, blood spatter. So the crime scene manager is, when it comes to the early stages of the investigation, their God. They decide everything and every decision they make at the very first instance can determine the success or failure of any investigation.
Today, police have an infinite number of modern resources to draw upon. Back in 2000, Will's team faced a much more difficult challenge.
In our era of the digital era, CCTV, the panopticon existence we live, where everything we do is observed, it's measured, it's caught on our mobile phone, it's caught on our watches, it's caught on city CCTV. An investigator back in 2000 will obviously take full advantage of all the forensic capability at the time. They were cutting edge, but today they look practically prehistoric.
We relied much more on witnesses, informants, and a little bit of telephone. Pagers would have been much more prolific around then. Officers investigating murder would have taken house-to-house inquiries. They would have checked for CCTV in the area. They would check for any cameras that were on the roads at the time. But we are going back 23 years, so there have been far less cameras.
The limited CCTV in the vicinity of the Paradise Bar has no footage of the attack or suspects. So police are hoping that forensics at the crime scene will provide the killer evidence.
The preservation of a crime scene is essential for a proper investigation and, of course, a very effective prosecution. If it's not protected properly, then, of course, the defence will have a field day. Every crime scene is contaminated. First responders contaminate a crime scene. Police officers, an open window, dust. There's DNA from a multitude of other people at the scene. But the issue is, it's not that it's contaminated, it's just that that story is a more complicated story to tell. So the issue is unraveling that complicated crime scene. So the key thing is, within the standard confines of first responders and early detectives and members of the public initially at a crime scene, the officers must cordon off the crime scene and protect it.
One of the things that we do look for at the scene is footmarks and fingerprint marks. I mean, someone perhaps may not arrive there without gloves on. They may have, there might be wet blood on their fingers. That may be then attached to handles, to the walls. There may be footprints of trainers, something like that, which we could compare at a later stage if that same trainer is found, and we could put, two and two together.
What you're looking for is fingerprints that might take you from A to B quickly. And that would be of good evidential value.
The concept of identifying people in terms of their finger marks has been around for centuries, and it's based on the ridged skin that you have all across your palms and across the soles of your feet, so your palmar and plantar surfaces. They're one of the last identifiable biometric features to disappear after your death. So if they are immutable and they don't change, other than a really deep-seated scar into the dermal layer of your skin, then you can potentially use them to identify people. The job of the forensic investigator is to work out where those evidential finger marks might be. Those marks are then recorded, sent into a fingerprint bureau for those fingerprint experts to work on to identify to whom they belong.
The forensic investigators managed to find a number of fingerprints around the scene of the crime, which they hope might help reveal and narrow down the identity of the suspects.
Fingerprint analysis in a public area simply will never give you a definitive link between a suspect and a crime at the time the offence took place. It will, however, give you a window into a story. This perhaps is an old haunt.
That doesn't put the person there at the material time. But if you arrest a suspect who says, I've never been to that pub in my life, and you find their fingerprint on the door, then, how did your fingerprint get there?
Part of the evidential work an investigator has to do to prepare themselves for trial, because inevitably a defence team will say, well, where are the fingerprints of my defendant, my client, at that bar? And of course you can say, well, we found it there, but we acknowledge we can't link it necessarily to the date and time of the crime.
Next, the investigators turned their attention to the blood left at the scene of the crime. First, they look at the patterns of blood spatter to give them a clear idea of the attack.
George Napier clearly collapsed through the course of his injuries, and then there's pooling of blood from his injuries onto the ground. The blood pattern analysis looked like a very violent, indiscriminate attack, really, with a number of wounds into wet blood which has then been splashed back up the walls.
But strangely, some of the blood patterns didn't conform to what the police thought they knew about the attack.
Down in one corner of the foyer was low-level blood distribution that was going in an upward direction. I would say it was about a foot off the floor and sort of streaked up about another foot, which I thought was rather strange. But at first thought, well, maybe George had got stabbed in the leg and he had kicked out, or somebody else had got stabbed in the leg. But then looking just outside the door on the street, I noticed there was small spots of blood, and they were evenly spaced.
There was a trail of blood leaving the scene, and that was clearly obvious. Immediately you would think that that was perhaps one of the other perpetrators who had been injured at the time.
In a stabbing assault, it's quite common, especially if that is a frantic attack, for the person holding the weapon, sometimes their hand can slip down the blade and they can sustain an injury which is dripping blood into this crime scene. In this case, we've got the trail of blood drops that lead discreetly away from that crime scene. Now, the immediate sort of switch in your brain will be, great, the perpetrator has cut themselves. So I'm going to follow that trail. It might lead, if I'm lucky, back to their home address. Then that can lead to the identity of the killer.
Investigators take samples from the blood trail for DNA testing. They realize this may be a significant piece of evidence in their hunt for George Napier's killers.
It was important that that blood is preserved, so we did preserve that as much as that trail as we could with plates on top of it.
The lead investigator and the crime scene manager follow the trail of blood along the road.
The droplets went round the corner and up to a cab office where it just kind of stopped. So we thought at first, well, has our suspect been injured and got a cab? But the cab office was spoken to and were adamant that no, nobody with an injury, blah, 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 had got into their cab. but beyond that, there wasn't really much that we could do.
The trail frustratingly hits a dead end. Just past midnight, they are forced to abandon their search.
It was the next morning when light was better. Further up, that trail was picked up again. But at that time, I noticed that they were evenly spaced, and from the droplets, it didn't appear that they had come from a great height. Because as a droplet hits the surface, depending on what the surface is, it will sort of like expand out.
The pair follow the blood trail until it abruptly stops outside the entrance to a New Cross flat.
I made a decision to try and hold that address, put guards on it front and back, and called in extra resources to actually break into that address and search it for suspects, fully anticipating there were suspects in there.
As the police burst into the apartment, they're floored by what they find. Home alone is an injured pit bull terrier dog.
At the time, I didn't know what made that blood, the blood splashing, until we found an injured dog. It was a possibility then that those blood trail was caused by that dog.
It turned out that the dog, which was a pit bull terrier, had a severe injury to its head where it had been stabbed right through the head. We knew that this was obviously the dog. The question was, could we prove that the blood at the scene was from the same dog?
This is a dramatic twist in the case. Clearly, the pit bull terrier was injured in the attack on George Napier, and the police have tracked its blood trail to this address. It's a massive step forward in the hunt for George's killers.
Police investigating the horrific murder of bouncer George Napier in New Cross, London, are making progress. They have a key witness statement. George's body, and police are testing George's clothing, which may contain the suspect's DNA or fibres, along with fingerprints and blood in the bar where he was stabbed. But the biggest breakthrough is a blood trail from the crime scene, which led to an abandoned and injured pit bull terrier.
The dog is key to the police investigation. It offers an opportunity to track its owner, one of the 4 suspects in George's murder. And evidence obtained from it could be crucial to crack the case.
But first, the police have to seize the pit bull.
Will wanted DNA and fibre taping on the dog because it might have blood, if it did bite somebody else, it might have blood on its snout that comes from the suspect and all that. He said, oh, well, I'll leave that to you. I said, no, I think we'll get a vet to do that. I wasn't going to go anywhere near it.
The police believe the pit bull terrier is a key piece of evidence towards finding the killers. Their inquiries identify its owner, a notorious New Cross criminal named Spencer Shepherd.
We've discovered that Shepherd had been seen many times with a very similar dog walking around, and we knew that he had, there was police intelligence reports that he had 2 dogs, one named Colonel, one named Gaddafi. And the address the dog was found in could be definitely linked to Spencer Shepherd. It was certainly the flat belonged to Spencer Shepherd. It wasn't too far from the scene of the crime. And the fact that only the dog was found in there was important to us. And that dog was recovered. It was taken to a police pound. It was treated by a vet, and samples were taken from the dog.
Finally, the police have a suspect. But with no positive results from fingerprinting at the pub crime scene, they need to prove that Shepherd was with his dog at the time of the murder.
We need forensic evidence and you need crucial evidence. I mean, it's just specifically important in this case because we knew, or we had intelligence, that Spencer Shepherd fled the country to Spain.
This poses an extra problem for the police. It requires obtaining a European arrest warrant to bring Shepherd back to the UK.
Anybody who thinks that a European arrest warrant is something easy to obtain is very clearly mistaken. It's a highly complex process. It involves all sorts of diplomatic engagement with international police forces, Interpol. The reality is that once the police are able to build up a case against them, link the dog to the crime scene, and obviously confirm that the key suspect owned that dog, then they were able to build a prima facie case on the face of the facts, be able to build a case for a European arrest warrant. The forensic officers and the senior investigators would have to give sworn testimony in a magistrate's or crown court to secure that European arrest warrant. It's a complicated process and it's quite a high bar.
We had to get all our ducks in a line, as you were, which meant that we needed to forensically link Spencer Shepherd not only to the scene via the dog, but also the dog to him. And once we had those things in place, then that would be sufficient to apply for an arrest warrant.
Police decide to check whether the blood smeared up the wall of the pub and along the road belongs to the dog.
The blood samples went up to the forensic science laboratory. They reported back that it wasn't human blood, but it was then important to try and find out the source of that blood. They gave an indication it's probably dog's blood, but they couldn't take that any further.
It's a frustrating setback. The dog blood test to prove the match is not possible.
Essentially, all mammalian blood has very similar constituents. It's just blood. So all of the presumptive tests that we use will react with cow, dog, cat, human, etc. But the DNA tests that we use are very specific. They're species specific. So a human DNA test will not get any result from any other animal whatsoever. So if you're looking for dog blood in particular and you wish to know which dog it's from, then a dog-specific DNA test will only bind with parts of the DNA which are specific to canines.
To have an animal as effectively a co-conspirator, a co-accused in a murder is bizarre. It's nearly unheard of. Certainly in this country, it's never happened before. And therefore, the engagement with animal DNA, the DNA from a dog, and the crime scene, it's just extraordinary. This dog and his DNA is the key to solving this crime. You've got your suspect, job's a good one, it's a self-solver. But the involvement of the dog in the scene complicated it so extraordinarily.
Police are thwarted by the lack of a dog DNA test, so they have no choice but to try and find human DNA evidence from George's clothing and the pub which might belong to the killers. But it's more bad news. There is nothing of evidential value from clothing, and the blood only matches George and an animal. On the 14th of November 2000, 4 days after George's murder, police put out a public appeal in search of new leads.
The decision to make a public appeal is a very complicated one. It's made at the very senior levels of any police force. The concerns are you create a moral panic. You maybe generate far too many irrelevant leads. And you also perhaps deliver a bit of information to the suspects who then begin to find out and are able then to deflect and manage their own defence from what's now slowly seeping out into the public realm. So often it doesn't smack of desperation, but it does show that investigation is reaching certain corners, hurdles that they're struggling to get over. In this instance, the issue of matching animal DNA and engaging with that in relation to any murder investigation, very complicated. And it's a fresh area of forensic science and indeed kind of criminal law in the UK. So any further information or intelligence that an investigating officer can get from the public to add to that, that's only going to help the investigation.
There was a lot of local news interest, whether that be TV, radio or South London press. And aside from that going out and the public and having whether that's people that have seen, heard or witnessed something, you'd also have people that are registered informants that would come forward. I was a controller for sources for informants, and information was passed on by a number of people, not just one person. We identified the suspects through a number of sources.
Informants and witnesses told police that the 4 suspects they were looking for were Spencer Shepherd, his brother Louis, and friends Daniel Clark and Dwayne Daniels. Police now knew that it was Spencer Shepherd who'd been turned away from the club by George Napier earlier in the evening, before returning with his dog and the other 3 men.
I was undercover for a major investigation many moons ago as a bouncer, and I know that dynamic, imposing yourself on disgruntled and often drunk members of the public. It's a difficult role, and managing people, and people are often very upset and very grumpy and very difficult, and they give verbals, and sometimes they give a bit of pushing and shoving. Very rarely do you see somebody returning back with a pit bull and a knife. It's exceedingly rare.
We know that Spencer became extremely enraged just for being asked to pay the entrance fee to get into this club. And we have to wonder why somebody would react in such an extreme way. To me, it ties in with his pride in his criminal status. So the culture amongst him and his peers and within his gang would be that anybody that's seen to disrespect them, especially publicly, needs to be met with extreme violence.
Crucially, eyewitnesses also reveal how the pit bull terrier was injured during this attack.
We got information that, from talking to other witnesses, that there was a dog with these guys, and the dog had gone rather berserk and actually it tried to attack the guy who had the knife, and he stabbed the dog in the head.
The head wounds match the pit bull held by the police, which makes DNA linking it to the crime scene imperative. The knife man is also identified as Dwayne Daniels, one of Britain's most prolific criminals.
All I know from Dwayne Daniels, he's been offending since he was 14, and taking drugs at the same time, and he was just a very prolific offender. He would burgle the whole streets until he heard police sirens and then escape. Dwayne Daniels was probably one of the most violent individuals this country's ever seen. At one stage, he was convicted of a whole string of aggravated burglaries, including one in fact where the part of the victim returned and he couldn't identify his girlfriend. She was so badly beaten inside a house.
The main culprit for the stabbing was Dwayne Daniels, and we know that he was using cocaine earlier on that night. People who already have violent tendencies can be disinhibited by certain substances, particularly cocaine. They become more impulsive than usual, and it means that they care less about the consequences of their action.
As new information trickles in from the public appeal, police receive yet another important breakthrough from one of their informants. They are given the location where the gang dumped incriminating evidence.
With intelligence gleaned from that informant, there was a recovery of some clothes, and that led to a very extensive search of the area with a search team that eventually found a bloodstained knife which had been discarded down a drain in the road.
It's another huge breakthrough in the case. If this is the murder weapon, then forensic tests can link blood traces found in it to George Napier, or even perhaps the injured pit bull terrier.
Investigators hunting George Napier's killers have amassed a large amount of evidence. From eyewitness statements, the victim, clothing, fingerprints, blood from the crime scene, and an injured dog, which has led them to discover the identity of 4 suspects. But they still don't have the concrete evidence they need to charge the 4 men. Will the assailants' discarded clothes and murder weapon give them the killer evidence they need?
The police now have a key piece of evidence that may pin the suspects to the crime. But with no proof yet placing the suspects at the crime scene, and with all 4 in hiding, the investigators know that they still have their work cut out to bring George's killers to justice. Police send the suspect's clothing and knife to the forensic science laboratory for DNA testing.
Knife was recovered, and from there you can do a number of things with weapons. Was it the knife that was used for the fatal stabbing? And you do that by DNA, obviously, from the victim, which is all controlled. Type of knife it is, as well, which is important. Does that knife match that wound?
DNA results confirm the blood on the knife matches the victim, George, and a dog. While the clothing contains George's blood, which links the suspects to the crime scene. But it's not a slam dunk for the police, as the suspects can claim they were innocent bystanders that got splattered by blood.
In a public environment, it's going to be very hard to actually link someone's blood to someone else in the bar when the issue and possibility that they could have bumped into somebody, they could have stood beside somebody at the bar. But if you add in an extra piece of evidence, then now you're building up a platform of evidence. Now you're building up a case that the prosecution can take to trial.
The tangible evidence that we had at that stage of any linkage at all was an injured dog. We had to put that dog to the scene. I mean, he could turn up later on and say that the dog got injured the day before. It was nothing to do with the murder or that scene, never been there. So you had to get very precise evidence.
Over 2 months after George's murder, police finally make a breakthrough. They discover the only facility in the world that can provide a dog DNA test at the University of California in Sacramento. Can they finally prove that Shepard's dog was at the murder scene?
So I had to authorise Will to travel to California to take the DNA sample from the dog that had been recovered and the samples that were in the trail of blood to prove that the dog and the trail belonged to the same animal that was used in the attack.
We needed to just match the two together. Scientists there were able to do that and came back with a percentage chance of 1 in a million.
What's interesting about this case is that it actually is forensics which got it across the line, an extraordinary journey of forensics from the UK labs which could bring the investigation so far to an American lab which could indisputably confirm that it was a 1 in a million chance that it wasn't this dog at the crime scene.
Dog DNA was crucial because that was the first real step in linking the whole sequence of events, really. To place that dog at the scene, that could then embroil Spencer Shepard into this scene. Once you had Spencer Shepard, we had the clothing. DNA were obtained from the clothing of these co-conspirators in this. So it all linked together, really, and started off with the dog.
This final piece of evidence enables police to apply for a European arrest warrant to extradite Spencer Shepard from his hiding place in Spain.
We never got to the stage of actually getting an arrest warrant. It was in the process. They're quite complex. You can't do these things overnight normally. It's got to go in front of the court, it's got to go in front of the CPS. It takes some time. But pressure has been put on the Spencer Shepard's family all the time, and eventually word got back to him, and he came back into this country and surrendered to police.
Shortly after, police catch 2 of the other suspects, Daniel Clark and Spencer's brother Louis, leaving just Dwayne Daniels on the run.
Dwayne Daniels was wanted for this murder, and we didn't know where he was. He was involved in a gang called the Hole in the Ceiling Gang, who were doing armed robberies at post offices and building societies. It was called the Hole in the Ceiling Gang because they used to break into the flat, normally the occupied flat above, hold the people hostage in there, and then close to when the shop would or whatever would open up, would then break through the ceiling, assault the people working in there, and try and steal whatever they could. Dwayne Daniels was just a violent man. I think he enjoyed violence, and people who suffered quite serious injuries on this. There were people tied up with wire, there were people stabbed, there was one case one was hit with a mallet. They were tied up, they couldn't do anything, couldn't go anywhere, but he still assaulted them.
When we look at somebody like Daniels, it really shows a pattern of somebody who lives and is completely committed to the criminal lifestyle. Not only is he probably ingrained in this through his gangs and his peers, but he probably doesn't care about the legal consequences.
Despite extensive police investigations, they can't find Dwayne Daniels.
For people who want to go into criminal fraternity, if you want to go into hiding, it's very difficult. It's very difficult psychologically. Most criminals really won't ever move, no matter how wealthy they are, from their own community. They'll still do the same things because they find it so hard to break their old connections. But eventually, most gang members, most criminals go into hiding. They're eventually caught at some stage. And this is what happened to Dwayne Daniels.
On the 2nd of February 2001, 3 months after George's murder, Dwayne Daniels' luck finally runs out. He and his hole-in-the-ceiling gang mount a violent armed robbery on a West London building society.
They assaulted the 2 people that worked in a building society, almost stabbed, one had her hair pulled out in a big lump. They decamped without stealing anything, but ran into the hands of a police officer outside.
Dwayne Daniels is arrested and remanded in custody. Police have amassed a weight of incriminating evidence linking Daniels to George Napier's murder. But after all their efforts, they finally receive an unexpected bonus.
Dwayne Daniels was arrested, obviously, for the robberies initially. One of the gang he was arrested with ended up giving evidence of a confession that he made to him about the murder of George Napier.
Dwayne Daniels is charged with the murder of George Napier. And Spencer Shepherd, his brother Louis Shepherd, and Daniel Clark are all charged with GBH.
The battle to get justice for the murders of George Napier was pretty monumental. The police gathered key witness testimony, placing the suspects at the scene. DNA evidence connecting the suspects to their clothing, and blood on the knife to the victim. And of course, the cherry on the cake was the canine forensic testing, which was able to connect Colonel, the pit bull terrier, to the location where George was murdered. And this is the kind of evidential clout that the prosecution needed to get the conviction across the line.
On the 19th of November 2001, a year after George Napier's death, Dwayne Daniels is convicted of his murder.
Dwayne Daniels pleaded not guilty. However, the jury quickly saw through his account, and within an hour of retiring, came back and found him guilty. He was sentenced by the judge, and he's summing up describing him as one of the most violent persons ever to go in front of him in the Old Bailey, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment.
The judge, in his summing up, was pretty emphatic. He said that the antecedents, the background to this defendant, Dwayne Daniels, was appalling. This murder was committed some 4 months after his release from a 10-year sentence for violent offences, with 950 other offences taken into account. He said, in his view, there were no mitigating features. He noted that Daniels had taken drugs, but this was no mitigation. It is clear, he said, that Daniels poses a most serious threat to society. When at liberty, I believe, he said, he should serve no less than 25 years.
Daniels would receive a further 6 life terms for his hole-in-the-ceiling gang armed robberies. Spencer Shepherd gets 8 years. Brother Louis and Daniel Clark, 5 years for grievous bodily harm. Colonel, the pit bull terrier, whose blood proved to be the killer evidence in the case, is ordered to be put down.
The judge at the end of the trial said that because the dog was used in the commission of offence, he had his only option was for us the dog to be humanely destroyed, which he was.
The murder of George Napier fits under the scope of a violent gang that were abusing drugs themselves and the violence that goes on behind it. It's also what happens under that influence of drugs.
This particular time in South London in 2000, there was a lot of crack cocaine, especially in that area of London. It was quite a violent area. Clearly, Spencer Shepherd was most annoyed having been ejected. And Spencer thought he was being disrespected.
People don't like that, especially if they've been taking drugs or drinking heavily. You've confronted me, I'm now going to get my own back. These type of crimes, there's more than one victim. Obviously there's a victim who's been murdered, but he was a gentle giant working for his partner and kids. His family suffered. The number of kids, they have no father figure. He was going about doing his lawful job, was attacked for doing his job, and because the individual just would not pay the £5 entry fee.
The murder of George Napier led to a groundbreaking investigation. Colonel the pit bull terrier, around which the whole case centred, made legal history as the first time canine DNA was used to help convict a UK murderer. Without this key forensic evidence linking the assailants to the crime scene, the guilty may very well have walked free.